Welcome to the Matt Waller Podcast, where we look at success at the intersection of technology, logistics, supply chain, retail, and CPG, also known as the retail value chain. I want to clarify that this podcast is distinct from my responsibilities as a professor in the Sam M. Walton College of Business. Nonetheless, it aligns with my aspiration to provide practical insights to professionals and business by showcasing companies and people that can enhance your ability to manage, lead, and strategize and market effectively in the retail value chain. Before we dive into today's exciting episode, I'd like to thank our sponsor, New Road Capital Partners. New Road invests in proven technologies, services, and products that serve unmet needs in the marketplace. They look for companies in supply chain and logistics, as well as consumer-oriented companies. For more information, go to newroadcp.com. I would also like to disclose that I am a strategic advisor to New Road. I'd also like to recognize podcastvideos.com for the services they provide for these podcasts. I'm very pleased with their services. And now, without further ado, let's get into the exciting episode. I have with me today Jason Miller, who is a full professor at Michigan State University in supply chain management. He's also interim department chair. Jason has over 40,000 followers on LinkedIn, and I'm one of them. And there is no one I follow closer personally on LinkedIn. I read his posts every day. One thing Jason does that is really interesting, so he's an expert in supply chain management, especially logistics and transportation. But he also understands economic theory really well and applies those kinds of tools to freight and logistics. And if you read his post, which I would encourage you to do, and I have a link to his profile page on my post about this podcast. But if you read them, you see that he uses data, and he uses that data and explains something that's really important to industry. Not just trucking, it's much broader than that, as you will hear when you listen to this podcast. In this podcast, we go deep, and one of the things that I really like about Jason's posts and what he does is he uncovers fallacies that people believe, rules of thumb that just aren't true, and the data shows it. And you'll see that when you listen to this podcast. And if you typically listen to this podcast, you might want to watch it on the YouTube channel. You don't have to. You can understand it because we describe every graph we talk about. But if you actually want to see the graphs, you can watch it on YouTube. But it's very insightful. We went for quite a while. We could have gone twice as long. It was a very interesting conversation. If you are a shipper, if you're a carrier, if you're a broker, if you're a student of supply chain management, I really think you should watch this. I also think Jason is sort of a paragon of a professor in business because, a lot of times when you hear the word theory, professors are known to use theory. Many times people think, that's useless. What's really happening? But good theory not only can describe, explain phenomena that we see in logistics and supply chain management, but it can also predict it. And Jason's work does that. And so what's interesting is he's a very successful professor in terms of publishing academic journals and peer-reviewed journals, but he also has a huge following in industry. And to me, that's like the quintessential goal of a business professor, to have something that's so relevant that it's not just relevant to the academic community, it's also relevant to practice. And Jason demonstrates that. So it's a really exciting episode. I think you're going to enjoy it. Thank you so much, Jason, for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for having me on, Matt. It's a great chance to chat and catch up.
Well, Jason, I want to jump right into a graph. So this is a really interesting chart, and it's titled Insufficient Supply of Materials as a Reason for Operating Below Full Capacity, based on a census survey. And at the bottom, we're going from 2014 to 2024, so you've got a lot of data there. And then the vertical axis is proportion of plants that are saying there's insufficient supply of materials and that's why they're operating below full capacity. And these lines, the vertical lines on each dot are the 80% confidence interval. So this is a really, telling graph. But explain it to us a little bit more about the source of the data and what it's telling us.
Yeah, so this is data from a program the Census Bureau does called the Quarterly Survey of Plant Capacity Utilization. It is a legally mandated survey that if you are a plant in the United States and selected to participate, you must fill this out per requirements. A lot of that is because the Department of Defense and the Federal Reserve Board need these data for some of the projects that they work on. But what the Census Bureau does is each quarter they ask about 7,500 manufacturing plants if you're operating below your essentially full capacity. And they define that basically as if you had normal conditions, normal, maybe even a strong market condition, and you didn't have equipment issues. What are reasons maybe you're not operating at that level? And one of the things that can be checked is insufficient supply of materials. And what you see is this data is really boring up till about 2017. Folks are saying this 5% of the time, so it's very minimal. Then it jumps a little bit during our manufacturing burst that we had due to strong commodity markets, strong global demand. From 2017 to 2018, it gets up to about 10% by mid-2018. Then we have a manufacturing recession 2019, falls back to like 7% again. And then we get to the good old 2020. And actually, we don't see much exciting happening in 2020 until about Q4. But then we get to 2021. And starting in the first quarter of that year, this series just takes off. It goes from 15% all the way to 25%. And that first quarter of the year was when we had that horrible polar vortex that caused massive disruption and chemical production, which cascaded downstream to plastic products and paper products, etc. And then this series just kept getting worse and worse and worse. It reached a peak in the fourth quarter of 2021 of almost 45% of manufacturing plants saying that a lack of materials was a reason they weren't producing as much as they could have. Again, pre-COVID, that number was a peak of 10%. So this is 4x worse. First half of 2022, things are fairly rough, but then things started to improve, essentially smooth and steadily all through 2022 through 2023. And the data point that for me was the most interesting was going to be the first quarter of 2024. Now, there's about a 75-day lag between the end of the referent quarter and when these data are released. So we got these data around June 16th or so, somewhere in that space. I was honestly expecting an uptick a little bit with the Red Sea crisis, Panama Canal water levels, and all of these things. But we actually saw a nice drop again to bring the series down to 10%, which is the lowest it's been since the fourth quarter of 2020, and actually comparable to the second and third quarter of 2018. And the reason I say that, these ideas are important is one was a concern I'd always had with the Census Bureau data was maybe we had primed people to think about insufficient supply of materials. And I'm like, they're just always going to check this box more than what they did before. Well, that doesn't appear to be the case, because certainly if we had primed people, they should not have been checking that box less in the first quarter of 2024. But it also just shows that even with all the discussion of the Red Sea crisis and everything else, we are not seeing anywhere near the type of disruptive effects that we saw in 2021, which really then makes us think, okay, we see container spot prices today are at levels where they were actually at in the first half of 2021. but we're not seeing anywhere the same type of disruption. And so that just forces us, as we think as, academics or as managers, to understand what is it about the current situation today that is so different, because clearly this is not affecting plants receiving inputs. And a lot of what we do bring in containers is an input to a further production process. And so this data took me a little bit by surprise, and it's very precisely estimated by the Census Bureau. And so we know that this is basically 10.3% plus or minus about 1 percentage point.
That is amazing. And of course, your other chart verifies this in a different way, looking at transportation and logistics constraints.
Yeah, we see the exact same pattern emerge. I mean, and these two series correlate something like 0.98 with each other, meaning it's just shocking how much these two ideas seem to track together. And again, though, we see, I really thought this one would bump up a little bit in the first quarter. But we didn't see that. And again, for perspective, we're not saying things are back to 2014, 2015 levels. They're not. They're still running, substantially above where we saw back in those days. But we're not seeing anything like the disruptions we saw in 2021, which again, I receive a lot of questions. Well, ocean spot prices are so high. What does this mean for inland transportation? It's like, well, the answer right now is really nothing, because it's a very different dynamic of what has caused the increase in demand today from a carrier standpoint versus what it was in 2021.
So, Jason, here we have another graph, and this is DAT, dry van contract and spot rate with fuel surcharge included. And so the red line, and this is over time from 2013 to present, the red line spot, and the black line is brokerage contract, I believe, and then the prices are on the vertical axis. So first of all, would you tell us a little bit about DAT data, and then explain what we're seeing here?
Yeah, so DAT Freight and Analytics is a large data provider in the trucking space. And what they do is they have data for spot pricing. And so spot pricing in the trucking sector, and specifically truckload operations. So a shipment going from point A to point B, typically 30, 40,000 pounds of freight on that. A spot price is a one-time price negotiated between a shipper and the carrier for transportation on a lane. And so spot rates make up somewhere in between 10 and 20% of how loads are priced, but they shift very dynamically based on market conditions. So we'll often say spot truckload rates are the canary in the coal mine in terms of where the market is going. And this is specifically for dry van truckload operations, which is moving essentially goods in, a standard van type of container. And what we see here over time is essentially multiple market cycles that occurred. And we saw a bull market in really the back half of 2013, first half, and then all through 2014, where a bull market means conditions are good from a carrier standpoint. They're bad if you're a shipper. Then, so spot rates go up during bull markets. 2015 and 16, spot rates go down. It was a bear market. We had then this very strong bull market starting kind of in the middle of 2017, lasted through most of 2018. Then we had this bear market in 2019. You'd see spot rates go down. COVID hit, we went from rates plunging because we had this massive drop in freight demand to taking off on the other side. Primarily, not so much because of total freight demand being so strong like it was in 2017 and 2018, but a unique dynamic whereby once COVID hit, you saw some firms have huge surges of demand. So canned food manufacturers may see demand increase 50, 60%. And in truckload operations, that is actually very bad if I'm a carrier. So this is going to sound very different to folks who may think about manufacturing, wanting to run their plants as much as possible. Because if you go from A to B, you then need to go either B back to A, or you need to go B to C, etc. And so you plan to try to have some type of balanced freight network so you're not running your trucks empty and you're making no money. So all of a sudden, if I have a surge of 50% on that A to B lane, that actually is a challenge because I now need to have 50% more freight out of B to get me elsewhere. And so when COVID hit, freight networks got thrown completely out of whack. If Home Depot's selling 10, 15% more, goods than they were before, whereas steel mills are producing less at the same time by 10%. And so everything went out of whack. And what this did is it put a lot of freight on the spot market because carriers with whom shippers had contracts would say, I can't haul this stuff because my network is imbalanced. And so a lot of freight gets what we call rejected. At that point, a shipper has to find capacity to move it, so they go and get one-off pricing. So spot rates went really high all through the rest of 2020. And there was also demand increasing. Manufacturing turned back on. We had very strong imports. Then it actually felt like the spot market was normalizing a little bit. We had the February 2021 polar vortex, but then the big thing was the March 2021 stimulus caused this incredible surge of spending. And not only did that drive more freight demand, we also saw a commodity market surge start to take place, which increases demand for things like fracking. We had housing activity 20% higher than it was before COVID at this point. That's more loads of shingles and lumber and washing machines and carpets and everything that goes into a house. And so just the freight market was incredibly strong in 21. Not surprisingly, spot rates kept going up. It's also important to remember trucking saw a big drop in payrolls at the onset of COVID. And so we were trying to serve more freight demand in 2021 than there was before COVID with less payroll. And so that is itself going to be challenging. But then what happened was early 2022, once we got past Omicron, we essentially had a large surge of capacity enter the market, just as we would expect from basic economics. And then demand started to cool as the Fed raised interest rates. Housing starts turning down. A lot of manufacturers had ordered too much raw materials. A lot of manufacturers had produced too many goods. And so all of a sudden, freight demand starts to cool and then started to decline by the third quarter of the year. Supply kept coming into the market. These spot rates just started plunging. And they have been plunging essentially. They reached sort of a bottom around, actually about a year ago almost, in sort of May and June of 2023. And we've just been moving along essentially at trough since then. We saw a little bit of a surge in January of 2024 because of the extreme cold. Then we dipped down again. Right now, we're neutral year over year, which what's funny is, with inflation and everything else, this neutral year over year and considered to be very weak market conditions is actually near where the highs were in 2018, believe it or not. We're well above where we were in 2019, but it feels like very much sort of a bear market. And we've been in a bear market now for this extended period. And what you'll see looking at that broker buy contract rate, and what a truckload broker does is they'll go to a shipper and say, pay me X amount and I will find you capacity to move that load. And then the broker goes out and finds capacity, hopefully below X amount. That way they make money for it. And what we'll see is that black series will track the red series very well with a little bit of a lag, but it's almost always above it. When it's not above it or the two series are close, that actually is a very informative piece of information that we'll talk about here in a second.
I'll go to the next slide so we can talk about that. And here the metric is the difference between the spot and contract price divided by the average of the two. So it's kind of like the percentage difference between the two in a way.
No, exactly. And this metric has been very, very, very effective at sort of predicting when the market's going to turn. And the magic threshold seems to be 10%. I've got that drawn in here. I don't know why it's 10%. So this is one of those that there's an underline. Can't really tell you why it's this magical 10% threshold. But once we see this ratio, get around 10%, that tends to be indicative of the market either turning really strong for carriers or conversely turning weak. And what I've done is just highlighted some key dates to think about, okay, when would a freight bull market start? Those are in black. So for example, June 2017 feels like we enter a bull market. It's the last, after that, we drop down to that 10% threshold. By January 2019, we're above 15%. We're in a bear market. June of 2020, market flips over. April 22, it flips back. The key thing is right now is we're nowhere near apparently flipping back yet. And this has been I've been probably one of the most bearish individuals on the prospects for the dry van truckload sector over the past 6 to 8 months. A lot of that is there's been this historical beliefs that market cycles completely change within typically 2 at most 3 years. And so this idea that we could have a 2+ year freight recession was not really registering in for folks who believe, well, the cycle will only last XYZ as long. Whereas I take a little bit more of a what's the underlying fundamentals of supply and demand. And right now the underlying demand fundamentals are not such that I would see some type of surge of freight happening soon that would get us out of where we are. So my general view is, this is an election year. It's a highly consequential election. There's so much economic policy uncertainty out there right now that I don't see firms making the major capital investment decisions through the rest of the year. We're not seeing the Fed cut interest rates, which would help spur home building activity and residential fixed investment activity that generates a lot of freight. And we're never going to see fracking activity in the United States like we did, let's say, back in 2014, not because of government policies, but just because the underlying economics are completely different. And no one is willing to essentially fund fracking companies just going out and drilling like there's no tomorrow, like they did in 2013 and 2014. We're never going to do that again today. And so there's just not those demand drivers right now, from my standpoint, that really are set to turn the market anytime soon, and certainly not quickly.
I'm going to back up a second here and just make a note for listeners. I've already mentioned that you make posts every day on LinkedIn that include these kinds of analyses, but many times you talk about rules of thumb or fallacies that people believe, and you demonstrate how they are fallacies or folklore, and the data really is what they should be looking at. And you show how to do that. The other thing I noticed that was interesting on the previous graph, when we were talking about this big increase that we saw after 2020, you mentioned a lot of the increase was the result of the stimulus, right? And I totally agree. But it's interesting. I have watched the news and read articles over and over where, Jason, they don't say anything about that. They just say the supply chain broke. It's like, I don't understand. Either they're not trying to understand it or they have an agenda. I don't know which it is.
That has been, for me, such a frustrating thing, because there is no doubt that, supply chain glitches that we had in 21, it created, I think, a mentality among buyers to essentially want to obtain whatever they could obtain. We certainly saw things like motor vehicle prices that consumers paid went through the roof. And a lot of that was because the dealers were able to charge more because demand was really strong and supply was low because of chip shortages. But the thing is basic economics. Why was demand strong? And it was because we gave effectively most adults in the United States $1,400 checks. We still had expanded unemployment that individuals were on. We did stimulus like we've never, given before. And folks were not conservative in saving most of it. They went out and they spent most of it. And they were spending it heavily on goods, not on services, because you couldn't go to a Taylor Swift concert. right now. I mean, if you think about this right now, Taylor Swift tickets, you're lucky if you're paying anything less than $3,000 per ticket right now to go see the rest of the Eras tour. Think about how many goods $3,000 buys. And so you had folks spending more on goods during this time period. You had freight networks discombobulated. I've heard stories in 21 of companies making food products that have regional networks, that you'll have a plant here that ships to this region, plant here. They're out of stock, and so they're sending a truckload of crackers, as an example, from Washington State down to Atlanta, Georgia, because they can't stock out a key customer. And, that's one where I put on my freight hat and say, you sent a truckload of crackers 2,500 miles at $3 and, 25 cent per mile spot rates? Yikes, wowza. And so that was happening. But to me, the ultimate issue is how much money did we give out? And that's where Dean Croak at DAT Freight and Analytics, I remember he and I talking in January of 21, so before the big March stimulus. And we both kept saying, maybe the market is about to get around to normalize, because things were starting to cool a little bit. And then we had these two big rounds of stimulus, and that sort of set everything off. And so at the end of the day, it was really a demand story. And you can always think about it that if demand doesn't go through the roof, then you're not going to have all of these, supply chain glitches occur. Because if demand isn't high, companies can work through disruptions a lot easier. That's what we're seeing today, why issues like the Red Sea crisis are not causing, rampant shortages on, retailer shelves.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned Taylor Swift, and I know you've said before that your daughter is a big Taylor Swift fan, and I've always wanted to ask you, is she a Chiefs fan too now?
Not really. She's still figuring out football. She's much more ballet and things of that sort. So I'll admit I'm not a big sports fan. So I'll watch maybe the Super Bowl when it comes to football, but that's pretty much like the one game a year that I'll actually turn on the TV.
Well, let's go to the next set of graphs, and here we have quarterly containerized exports of U.S. manufactured goods to the world, not including Canada and Mexico, and it goes from 2002 to present. So this is a lot of data, and it's pretty interesting. And then down below, you've broken it out into the sectors, which is really nice. And the interesting thing you put in the far right-hand column, titled 2023 minus 2018, is the difference between the two. So you can tell which ones have increased the most, which ones have decreased the most, which ones have stayed the same. But going back to the original graph, what's the story you get from this?
Yeah, so a couple aspects of the story to me, and that is sort of one, just a strong secular increase up until really 2018 and 2019. We did have the COVID disruption, but we also had the tariff war start to take place. So we can't overlook that. So the strong secular increase in exports, of course, barring the crash that was the global financial crisis. And then just the dip in 21, 22, and 23. Now, part of 21 was demand was so strong in the U.S., everything was going to the domestic market. So a good example of this was plastic resins. So some of the things like Dow Chemical makes as an example. Because of the polar vortex and because of incredibly strong domestic demand, everything was staying domestic. And what happened was exports plunged. The only stuff that got exported was charged essentially a very, very, very high rate. So part of it was strong domestic demand. But then 22, 23, just essentially just weak demand in general from around the globe, especially in 23, kind of the bottom of that. And we have seen a little bit of an uptick now. But I mean, when you're talking these numbers, 20 million metric tons is an incredibly large number when you start to think about that. And even though we don't talk about the U.S. as a manufacturing export powerhouse, we still are the world's second largest manufacturing country. China is larger, but it's then us is a very clear number too. And so you start thinking about these numbers like 2 million metric ton difference. That's thousands and thousands and thousands of fewer containers of exports. And this is just what's going in a container. This isn't the bulk stuff that we send. And so it's, to me, this story of it's an additional headwind on domestic manufacturing. But just to put numbers in perspective, from the Commodity Flow Survey, 97% of what is shipped out of U.S. manufacturing plants that moves by for-hire truck is domestic destination. Only 3% is exported. And you're still getting numbers here that are in 20 million metric tons. I mean, so it puts the size of the U.S. economy and what we make here in perspective. But, the dollar's strong right now still. Demand in Europe remains weak. And that's, I think, what's setting things so different from, let's say, 2016, which was a weak year, but then we have this really strong 17 and 18. It was essentially the global economy was very strong, and we're just not seeing that right now. We have China manufacturing so much, trying to essentially prop up the economy because they're having such issues on the real estate side. But Europe is in general, in a weak economic condition right now. You have the United Kingdom hamstrung with Brexit. You have Germany that is still nowhere near recovered from the energy shock that they experienced once Russia invaded Ukraine. And, the European economy is not doing that strong right now. The Wall Street Journal just had an article today talking about the one bright spot for Southern Europe is, funny enough, American tourists going over there and spending money, which I can't help but start thinking, hey, could that have just an ever so slightly small hit on domestic demand for goods here in the United States? But that's, I guess, a different story and would take a lot more data analysis.
But a very interesting one.
Yeah, it's, the U.S., we have been really kind of the shining light in terms of the developed countries since COVID. And I think a lot of it is due to how much we stimulated. So this is this pro and con, right, of intense demand certainly caused some inflation, but that intense demand was due to stimulus that has helped elsewhere.
Would you like to say anything about these differences? Like, for example, food and kindred products took a huge hit there, and it's the second largest containerized product.
Yeah, no, it is. So, food prices in the U.S. have went up tremendously, but some of this as well as retaliatory tariffs. We've always been a major food manufacturer. The one really on a percentage basis to emphasize is paper. And that is an industry that people just don't think about as the average American in the United States. But paper manufacturing is a huge generator of freight, and it's a huge export category. It bats so much above and beyond what you would think about as a manufacturing sector. This piece that's, I don't even believe 1% of GDP. I think paper manufacturing is like 0.5% of GDP, but it is one of the biggest export sectors that we have. On a weight basis or a volume basis, if you want to think about it that way. And in general, we've seen a huge global downturn in paper production, not only in the United States, but in Europe and Germany. It's a big paper producer. Their production's down, 20% from where it was in 2018, kind of akin to where the U.S. is at. And, some of these other sectors too, wood products, no real explanation for that specifically. For why we would be down as much as we are, other than one of my thoughts would be wood that, especially things like chips and whatnot that go overseas to China, as an example. But just in general, you can see the story of just exports down really across the board, across most major, manufacturing sectors. The one that is up slightly is chemicals, and a good chunk of that is plastic resins. And if you take a look at, let's say, Europe's energy cost surge makes U.S. exports more attractive even with a strong dollar.
Well, and petroleum and coal, while it's not one of the biggest, percentage-wise, the decrease is quite remarkable.
Yeah, it is. And, and this is just so everybody understands. When we say manufactured petroleum and coal products, this isn't crude oil. This is stuff that is even going into a shipping container. So this could be things like greases and things of that sort. And we had seen a huge surge in 2018, 2019, part of 2020, and then we kind of dropped back. That would be one somebody who really knows like that specific part of the world would have to really dive in and be able to say like, this is what was going on over that period that was spurring this demand.
Well, if anyone knows, please put your, you can make a comment in the show notes and I'll share it.
Please. I am very curious to know that one too. I just don't have time to dig in.
Well, and so this next graph is seasonally adjusted trucking ton miles, seasonally adjusted index to where 100 is equal to 2017. It goes from 2017 to present, and of course it also has this huge change around to 2020. So could you explain this?
Yeah, so this index, and this is not just my product, this is also something I co-author with Yemboy Mole, who's the writer endowed professor at the University of Tennessee and great friend to both of us. Academia is a very small world for anybody listening, especially in the supply chain space. But what we do with this index is we know from the Census Bureau doing this thing called the Commodity Flow Survey, we know essentially what industries account for the most demand that for-hire trucking companies move. And in declining order of sectors, it is food manufacturing is about 15%. Chemical production is about 8%, 9%. Believe it or not, quarrying activity and hydraulic fracking is about 6%. So you see all those dump trucks on the road. It's like 6% of what trucks move is just literally bulk aggregates and things for fracking sites and whatnot. About another than 5% is this non-metallic mineral product category, which is like bricks and clay refractories and glass and cement and concrete blocks and things of that sort. And then, believe it or not, it's paper is up next. And you're probably saying, but wait a minute, what about stuff I buy from Amazon? Yeah, that's way down on the list. Stuff even Walmart shipping from their warehouses. We got to go down a couple more marks to get to that. And so trucking is really very industrial oriented, as you're kind of picking up on this. And so just with that background, 2017 through mid-2018, we have a very strong growth in trucking output from a historical standpoint. We see demand increase by about 5%. But we're in the middle of a commodity market boom, so a lot more fracking activity. Construction activity was really strong. Food production was going up. Basically, everything was firing really well. And the global economy is doing well. There's a big drop in January of 18. That's the polar vortex of January of 18. It was like 0 degrees up here as a high in Michigan, which we're used to cold, but even that for us, is like, this is cold. But then by the end of 2018, we start to dip down. A lot of this was retaliation due to the Trump tariffs. There's just overwhelming evidence that those tariffs have been very counterproductive to the U.S. economy. So we go down into a freight recession, kind of sort of move along a trough. It looked like we were climbing out in the middle of 19, but then we had an auto strike. So that's when you can blame the state of Michigan predominantly and GM. It put us back into a deeper freight recession. Moving along again, this trough, COVID hits. I have to truncate the graph, otherwise we lose all the detail because freight demand plummets almost 15% with the April lockdowns. Then we come roaring back, though. And actually, by the end of 2020, freight volumes were back to where they were in 2019, believe it or not. Then that huge drop you see is February 2021. That's a polar vortex. That's like 3% of freight demand gets wiped out. And then you just see we come absolutely roaring out of that. Some of the strongest growth of freight we've ever seen. It was actually almost double the pace of the growth we saw in 17 and 18. So the back half of 21 into the first part of 22 is just this incredible period for freight demand. Then we kind of hit a peak. That highest point is March of 2022. And that corresponds to when the Fed starts raising interest rates. And then we have still pretty high activity, and then that first drop you see is September of 2022. We start to go down. We have a deep polar vortex in December 2022. You're starting to see a theme here about extreme weather events and demand for trucking freight, which is really because manufacturing gets hit. And really since then, we have just been going down, and we've been basically in a trough and moving along a trough really since about I'd say late third quarter of 23. We had another dip. That's January 24. Again, polar vortex. A little bit of a bump up in February and March, down in April. Kind of though, I'd say just in general, moving flat. This is just because bluntly, manufacturing activity in this country is not doing that great. Wholesaling activity is not doing that great relative to 22. But again, it's worth emphasizing freight demand is above where it was in 2019. So it's not like we're in this deep recession, but we're down from those highs, and especially that torrid growth that we saw in the back half of 2021, which was, to be very clear, not a sustainable trajectory to be on. The only other time we were on that trajectory was actually 2004 through 2006 in the midst of our housing boom, and we all know how that ended 2 years later.
Very interesting. So this next graph looks at ice cream and frozen dessert. This is one of my favorites because I love ice cream.
Mine too. Mine too.
But you know, this is more. You really see the seasonality in this, I think.
Yeah, no, exactly. And this is one of those ones. So some of the content I try to put up is, sort of very serious. Where's the market at? Other of it's just kind of like random things that I see looking at the data that I may think would be interesting. And one of the things we talk about is almost all of the data presented to us by the Census Bureau, Bureau of Economic Analysis, and gets reported by the media is what's called seasonally adjusted. So we try to take out that regular temporal fluctuation that we know happens each year. But when you think about being a supply chain manager, you don't move seasonally adjusted freight. You move not seasonally adjusted freight. And so this is just to give folks a perspective of how seasonal some sectors are. And so with ice cream and frozen desserts, peak production is typically in June, but it's of course the summer months. But there's these big gaps throughout the year. So you may have production up 25, 30% in June from the yearly average, but it's down 25% in January. And it's just to highlight just how seasonal things are. And what I tend to find is that we don't think about seasonality to the degree that we should, is you start thinking like, okay, and of course, ice cream is going to require refrigerated trailers. So it may not fit as well in a context of a carrier only doing that. But if you're a fleet and you have a mix of, you do have some refrigerated and you haul ice cream, you may have fruit and vegetable preserving. Peak season there is a little bit later. It's kind of this July, August, September, a little bit into October peak. And so it sort of counterbalances. So you start thinking about targeting shippers and saying, hey, I want a little bit of this, because right as this season maybe starts to cool down, this season's going to pick up a little bit. And again, it helps with your planning. I used to work at a pickle factory, and I was seasonal labor. Started working the moment baseball was done in the summer, which baseball ended in June. We typically weren't good enough to make it on far enough in tournament. I needed to worry about July. And guess what? I worked July and August up until when school started in high school. And then I was done, but that was peak months in that sector, working in Northeast Indiana. And the one thing that has been interesting is a lot of sectors in manufacturing haven't been as seasonal as normal since COVID hit. I do wonder to what extent that is lack of seasonal labor, and we may start to see that return a little bit. But you can see that in this sector that the normal big seasonal fluctuations that we had happen, they've been absent since the COVID pandemic hit, certainly in 21 and 23.
So this graph is the number of non-employer businesses and general freight trucking, long distance. And we've heard you've shown something like this a few times over the past year. What do we gather from this?
Yeah, so kind of to take a step back, one of the challenges with trucking is the vast majority of industries in the economy, what we call employer firms, so firms with employees, make up the 98+% of activity. So take motor vehicle manufacturing. There's nobody out there building cars in their shop by themselves that matters from an economic standpoint. And the reason I say this is when you think about how the Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics have to devote their resources, there are approximately 12 million locations in the United States, so what we call establishments, that have at least one employee. There's another 30 million non-employer businesses. So this would be literally somebody operates a sewing operation out of their house, just them sewing together pillows, right? Just them. They buy the material, they do it themselves, they sell it on Etsy and whatnot. The reality is the Census Bureau doesn't care very much about non-employer firms. They're a very small share of economic activity. But that's not the case in every industry. Construction and especially trucking, non-employer firms matter, and they matter a lot. And so we get a lot of confusion about how do we think in trucking about what the main government data sources essentially officially track, and we get on a high frequency. Because we only get employment data from firms with employees. And so the non-employer statistics is a program the Census Bureau does through the IRS. So this essentially the IRS just hands the Census Bureau data is how this program works. But this actually lets us get a sense of how many firms are there out there where it is myself operating. I'm not an employee. I am effectively some type of owner-operator. In trucking, that could typically be leased to a carrier, or it could be I have my own operating authority, I run my own company, etc. And this data here is just showing the growth of these non-employer businesses over time. And in essentially the over-the-road drive-in truckload space is what we're focusing on here. Not that many folks are going to be doing LTL operations by themselves, but there will be some, believe it or not. There's far more firms out there that operate on hey, I got one or two trucks, I consolidate some small loads from some shippers here in Lansing, and I run them over to Detroit. There's a lot more people that do that than just Old Dominion and Saia and whatnot. But to not digress, vast majority of this, though, is folks doing truckload operations. This is just showing that number has almost doubled since 2012. And this gets back in part to the conversations routinely about a shortage of truck drivers and saying, well, it's fascinating that if there's this massive shortage and people unwilling to enter this market, we've got 300,000 individuals involved doing this as their own non-employer business back in 2012. Man, a steady upward trend to over 525,000 by 2021. And I guarantee you that number in 2022 is going to be at least 575. I wouldn't be surprised if it's not 600,000, just given lags that exist. And so part of this is saying, well, look, if there's a chronic driver shortage, boy, that's not showing up in that data right there, that people are unwilling to enter a sector. They clearly are. But also, too, the non-employer statistics, we do get a sense from a revenue standpoint of roughly what percentage of trucking revenue does go to non-employer establishments and non-employer firms. And it's roughly 20%. And the good news, though, about that number is it doesn't change over time. No, that's not what's shown here, but it just helps us understand things. But, this chart that you're putting up here right now, this is basically saying, okay, if we adjust the revenue that we have for these firms, because the IRS, again, has revenue data, Now, is it 100% accurate? Probably not, but it's close enough. This is saying, okay, we know the total revenue. We know the number of firms. That gets us a sense for revenue per firm. Let's adjust that for sector-specific price changes to basically get a proxy for real revenue per firm. So in other words, how big is the average firm? And what we can see here is, that's interestingly enough, these are non-employer firms. These are people with firms without employees. That number still went down actually 15% from where it was a decade ago. What that's telling you is there's a lot more people involved in trucking today, at least on the other side of the COVID bull market, that got in as part-time folks. Like, hey, I'm going to run some loads here, but I may work some construction here. And that's just something that to me is not really appreciated, is the vastness of this sector is something that we almost cannot wrap our heads around. And you'll have folks who may run just a few loads here and there, and they've got another job. I already mentioned the name before, but Dean Croak at DAT, Dean and I are friends. Dean's got his own trucking company. Dean drives an absolutely gorgeous rig. And Dean will go haul some loads from time to time just because he can. He was a driver in Australia for years. But Dean's primary job is with DAT. And so I don't think we appreciate how diverse trucking is, and that some of these firms are a farmer who, hey, they do their farming from, March through early November. You got some time off in December. There ain't much to do. Hey, I got my operating authority. I got my truck. I'll go move a couple of holiday loads for the local warehouse. And those are folks who are involved in trucking, believe it or not.
So Jason, trucking, especially long distance trucking and others even in trucking, have been noted as being very low concentration, having low concentration indices. So is it dropping over time?
Yeah, so we'll get data from the 2022 economic census on industry concentration next year, because it takes the Census Bureau a while to process essentially the entire U.S. economy, which is what we collect every 5 years. But I have no doubt that we will have less concentration in that over-the-road truckload space than what we did in 2017. And this is just a sector in general that is very low for economic concentration. And because of the economics of this, there never will be much concentration in over-the-road dry van truckload operations. The economics of the sector don't favor that. Versus less than truckload, where there is a lot of concentration, though interestingly enough, the failure of Yellow Corp actually caused the sector to become less concentrated, because Yellow was the third largest player prior to its failure, and how their freight got reallocated, a lot of it actually went to the smaller players, because FedEx Freight and Old Dominion Freight Lines, the two biggest players, didn't want a lot of this stuff. And so FedEx didn't really pick up much of Yellow's freight. So actually that sector, the failure of that company actually has led to less industry concentration. Unfortunately, we won't know that till the 2027 economic census, because Yellow failed in 2023.
So the trucking industry has always been used as a example of an industry that's highly competitive, close to perfect competition in some ways. And it seems like it's going even more in that direction. And I wonder, Jason, to what degree does just information availability and tools that are out there allow this to happen?
So I love the way you framed that, because I view the over-the-road truckload space as almost two distinct markets. And I'm going to simplify off of some fascinating work by Holmes and Stevens in economics, where they talk about industry structures kind of having typically a small number of very large generalists that play to the big market. And you have that. You've got your J.B. Hunts and your Knight Swifts and your Werners. Those firms, I view, that's not perfect competition at this point. This is monopolistic competition with a high substitutability factor. I mean, if Knight Swift decides, hey, we're going to charge 30% more, they're going to lose a lot of market share really quickly. But those firms are serving the largest shippers. They're providing asset-based capacity. They're competing really only with each other. They're not competing with the mom and pops. So we then have this tertiary or the secondary market of the smaller players. And I mean, again, this is a continuum. I'm really oversimplifying, but just saying big boys and girls and really small players. And obviously there's a lot of firms in between. So it's really a continuum, but I'm thinking about it from that sort of two extremes. You then have the small players. I think a unique dynamic that tends to be missed is there's this assumption that these small players are primarily spot market based, and they're really not. Most of them, if you got 4 or 5 trucks, you still have contractual relations with shippers to get most of your freight. And some colleagues of mine and I, we've published research using industry data showing this. But you're not serving Procter & Gamble. Not to be mean, P&G don't care if you got 5 trucks. But some small manufacturer in Sydney, Ohio, that is a one-plant operation that ships out 10 truckloads of freight a week, they care to have a small carrier who probably has got an operation in the Sydney, Ohio area. The managers and owners know each other, and you've got some type of, in a lot of cases, handshake agreement for what you're doing for these rates, right? And so these small carriers will have a decent portion of contract freight, typically with small shippers, and then they'll go to the spot market to get their backhauls. Now, what has changed over the last 30 years was 30 years ago, that spot market was not that robust. Brokers essentially almost were a bad terminology. Brokerage. Versus now shippers say, I strategically need brokers in my routing guide to get me capacity on low volume lanes, on inconsistent lanes, etc. And so what's happened is that these small players are better able to find those backhauls than before. And they're not so tied to that set of anchor shippers that they used to be. And we see this show up actually in a paper that was just accepted in Journal of Business Logistics with one of the alums from your wonderful university, Jonathan Ferris, as a matter of fact, where one of the things we picked up, and it was almost as an aside, was the rate that trucking companies die is much lower today. And it was much lower by 2018, 2019, and a downward secular trend than it was in the 1990s. And so it sounds weird to say, like, trucking companies don't die as rapidly as they used to. But this really showed up. And this was secondary to the paper, but it's like, wait a minute. Information availability, the ability to have essentially to find those backhauls and not being as tied to that local manufacturer that if that company goes out of business, we're done. But you still see that all the time in trucking is when you hear these announcements of carrier failures, oftentimes it'll be a statement, especially a little bit larger carriers. It's going to be, we lost our 2 key customers, or we lost this key account and we can't allocate 40 trucks elsewhere. And so while the information side helps, we can't overcome, again, those huge economies of scope that exist, that if I lose 30% of my business and I now have 30% of my trucks idle, finding enough freight to make a sensible network, especially if I'm regional, can be very difficult. So it certainly has helped. I think it helps the small operators start up and maybe, hey, I'm 1 or 2 trucks. I do play more spot market. I do well enough. I add that 3rd, 4th truck. Maybe now I can give some local shipper enough capacity. They'll give me some contractual business. But this is an area we need a tremendous amount more research for it to really get a sense and understand this, because we know from the Census Bureau there's about 155,000 trucking firms across all parts of the sector that have at least 1 employee. That is a really big ocean to start to figure out some of these nuances.
Jason, before we go to the next slide, I want to talk just a little bit about an article I read that just came to mind that you had written. You were the sole author on it. It was published, I don't remember the date, but it was published in a journal called Forecasting. And I thought it was really interesting. You were talking about basically how ARIMA models can forecast, the prices, rates, pretty well. I wonder, a couple things I wonder. First of all, could you give a little overview of that? But also, one question I had, and I forgot to think about this before the podcast, was, do very many firms use ARIMA models to make these predictions?
Yeah. So, boy, I had that as an article. That was an interesting one to write. A long time ago. I wrote that back. Oh man, I think it was 2018. I wrote it, and it came out in 2019. So basically, the idea being, if you want to forecast both spot and contract rates, your best prediction is essentially what was going on the exact month previously. And so a lot of people, one of the critiques I'll get is people say, well, you're only using backward-looking data. No offense to everybody, all data is backward-looking because it's data from the past. There's no magical, the market's projecting this out forward. Now, let's set that aside. But essentially, it's the idea of, you can use prior values of a series to get a pretty accurate forecast moving forward. But the thing that was interesting was, just as you would expect, spot market rates should be much more transient than contract rates. And that's exactly what showed up in the data, and putting some parameters on it. And I'd be curious to actually go back, take those models parameters, and just see how they performed in 2021 or, 2020, 2021. They would have a little bit of trouble. But I think in general, it would catch up really quickly. Like, it would be off, we'd be trailing. What's that? Yeah. It's one of those, like, maybe if I get some time and, as a department head, you've been a department head and a dean, getting some time to do anything is a challenge. But yeah, it was interesting to see in terms of using ARIMA in practice. I don't really get a sense that it's probably used that much because it is fairly technical. But, what I always joke with people is, on a scheme of technicality, ARIMA dates from 1970 is when George Box and some of his colleagues start developing this statistical approach. And so this is something that's, 50 some years old now, and it's still viewed as technical. I use ARIMA forecasting for Journal of Commerce's Intermodal Savings Index, both the contract and spot index. And I'll tell you what, a really simple model works really, really, really well with like a 1% mean absolute percent error, which is, for data, I'll take that every day of the week. And that's an out of sample made prediction for 3 months ahead. And it's just, again, a lot of series and supply chain are just typically in normal conditions really darn stable. And that really darn stable piece makes them forecastable, which is then helps explain why did things go so, chaotic in 2020 and 2021. It was because sort of the smooth behavior got completely demolished by these shocks that we couldn't really parameterize statistically.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Now, we're going to shift gears just a little bit here, and we're going to talk about another fallacy that people believe. But before we get into that, I want to talk about something else that you brought up that I was not aware of. And I might add, I really like how you use economic theory and economic research and apply it in this field. So everyone knows about the bullwhip effect. And the bullwhip effect essentially just says that uncertainty gets magnified as it goes up the echelons of the supply chain. So uncertainty at the retail level gets amplified as it moves up in the supply chain to the DC level, to the factory level, et cetera, et cetera. And there was an article in Journal of Operations Management a long time ago by Rich Metters, who's now at Texas A&M, but he was at Vanderbilt at the time where he got his PhD. I think he was at Vanderbilt when it was published, or it was from his dissertation. And he showed, this exists, but if there's capacity constraints, it's not as extreme as you might expect. But you brought up a point, and so when COVID happened and there was the stimulus, a lot of people were talking about the bullwhip effect. But you brought up in a post, also in a paper, you wrote a paper saying, hey, there's this other effect that's kind of similar that probably is a bigger issue. And I think it was called the inventory acceleration effect.
Yep.
And you discovered it in a economics journal, I believe.
Yeah, so it's funny. So the inventory accelerator actually predates the bullwhip effect by a long time. At least, and this is being conservative, the concept, you can trace it back to 1917 for capital investment. And as economists were talking in 1917, they were viewing inventory as capital investment as well. But for sure, 1941, we start to see the mentioning of this concept. And what the inventory accelerator is it's essentially the idea that when demand goes up, your absolute level of inventory will also increase. And the reason for that is because we typically have sort of target inventory to sales ratios or target days to turn inventory ratios, because we don't want to be turning inventory too fast, because if we are, we're probably stocking out a lot. We're not providing the associated service level. But we also don't want to be turning inventory too slow and be getting a poor return on investment. So what you'll see is if demand goes up, and if demand goes up very suddenly, so take what happened again with COVID, and think about what happened here. We've got data for general merchandisers up in this chart, and this is inflation adjusted inventory. So this data here is essentially controlling for inflation. The baseline of 100 is the first quarter of 2019, because as of today, we have data through the first quarter of 2024. COVID hits, and you get sort of two effects. First, everybody goes to the Walmart, Target, Costco, and liquidates pretty much everything on the store shelves in March. And then everything stops in April. And the department stores are all shut down at this point. So they're included in general merchandisers. So because of this, essentially the department stores practically stopped ordering stuff in the second quarter of 2020. And I mean, you can see this in their financial data. Like they just have nothing hardly arriving. So they're liquidating like crazy. They're just trying to get stuff out. Like they are convinced that like demand is just gone. So inventories dip suddenly and they really get drawn down. Well, demand then gets really strong come about June again, when people can go out and start shopping. And so I don't have on this chart real sales, but real sales for general merchandisers are going up then at this point in time. So you've got inventory really low and sales going up. So at this point, you do need to have a huge recalibration, and you need to not only increase inventory to just get back to where you were before you burnt down all of this, but you also need to get inventories even higher than before to essentially keep inventory balanced relative to demand. And boy, did general merchandisers do this. And you can see this in inflation-adjusted inventories skyrocket. Through 21 into 22, they go up over 25%. So this is physical unit stocks on hand increased by 25%. Well, the problem is then demand starts cooling with inflation and with consumers running out of stimulus. So inflation-adjusted sales flatline by early 2022. And inventories went up way too much. So now we're in a situation where we've got a glut. And you can see on this chart then the drawdown of inventories. And we're still almost 12% above pre-COVID levels. But that's also because demand is also decently above pre-COVID levels. You can see that Walmart, Target, Costco are selling more today, even adjusted for inflation, than what they were back in 2019. But essentially, this accelerator idea, everybody started talking about the bullwhip effect, but, Matt, you explained it perfectly. The bullwhip effect isn't about inventory levels. It's about volatility. And people would attribute this to the bullwhip effect, and I'll pick on, business journalists a little bit. they're not trained in supply chain in terms of going through, the classes, the coursework, the inventory stuff. And so they'll latch onto these terms without realizing, like, wait a minute, that actually isn't what that means. And so I've always said that really, as we think about what's happened since COVID, the bullwhip really isn't the story. Much more this inventory accelerator idea, which is actually the initial idea that predated the, Forrester discovering the bullwhip effect in the 50s and 60s at MIT. And then Hao Li and folks essentially, I'm going to say, rediscovering it, but popularizing it in the late 1990s.
Yeah, that's excellent. And it's interesting, Jason. So something that happened to me fairly recently, and I've talked to you a little bit about this, but of course, living in Northwest Arkansas, I'm around tons of suppliers because we've got suppliers to Walmart. There's like over 1,500 offices here. And the big CPG companies here have huge offices, some as high as 300 people. And they're not just sales teams, they're truly cross-functional teams. You've got all the different functions represented. And a lot of them are alumni, and so I know tons of them, and many of them live in my neighborhood. And so I see them all the time, and I'm always talking to them about these kind of things. That I'll tell you a theme that came out. It was really interesting. And the theme that came out was that we're not doing a good enough job of selling, because the retailers aren't ordering as much, right? Not just Walmart, but all of them. Yep. Okay? So that's a backdrop. I was at another event where there were a lot of senior retail executives from many different retailers. It wasn't a big group, but let's say 10. And one of the themes was managing inventory is one of the most critical success factors we have. And we need to do a better job of it. And so retailers right now in general are really trying to figure out how to manage manage inventory more effectively. So on the one hand, you've got suppliers thinking we just need to sell harder. You've got the reality of the inventory environment on the other. Would you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating you mentioned that because we're now in I'm going to say 2021. It was you ordered whatever you could. You probably inflated it a little bit because you were worried about shortages, and we were very loose on essentially inventory control because you just wanted stuff to sell. Because typically, if you had it, you were going to sell it. Now we're essentially cranked down the other way as we start to think about things. And that folks are being quite conservative. We are seeing, inflation-adjusted retail sales have rebounded. They are moving back up again. And so, which is a good sign. Now, the key thing, though, is they're not growing at the same rate they were growing in, let's say, 2014 through 2019. They're growing at a less of a pace now, but that's, again, because we just so goosed everything up in the back half of 2020 all through the first half of 22. That you're not going to have the same growth rate because we're, again, regressing back to the power of the long-term trend line. Cannot be ignored with this. But no, it's fascinating you hear that because I think that, a lot of CPG companies want to go back to where demand was in 2021. And it's like, we're not right now. Like that was a unique period in history. And that's why, I think one of the challenges is how do we teach everything that happened with COVID, but also explain to people, here's the lessons you really shouldn't take from this. Here's the mechanisms that were so distinct in this time period. And that chart that you have right there, Matt, just shows you, that literally vertical, that looks like, a rocket taking off in terms of how we build up inventories. And that just screams right off the bat, we clearly over-ordered, which now when you think back to what the suppliers are saying, they're remembering in 21 and 22, watching all those orders coming in and saying, well, we have to go back to that. Well, if you're drawing down inventory, you're ordering inherently less than what your demand is. That's the only way mathematically to make this work. And so it's interesting that what you're describing is exactly what the Census Bureau's data would say the narrative would likely be.
If you're finding value in this podcast, we greatly appreciate your support by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Additionally, following us on Apple and Spotify and leaving up to a 5-star review would be immensely helpful. We welcome any feedback or questions related to the podcast, as well as suggestions for further topics and guests. You can leave your comments on our YouTube channel, and rest assured that I will read each and every one of them. Please also take a moment to check out our podcast sponsors, as they play a critical role in keeping this podcast running. For more information on specific topics, timestamps, or links to articles mentioned during the podcast, head over to mattwallerpodcast.com.